that last slide is a great screensaver. It's a great reminder to each one of us. Are you guys hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. All right. Good. It's a good reminder for each one of us right now to go back to that place of innocence. Because as the poem said, we get so caught up in seeing things and hearing things and experiencing things in a whole different way that just gets us way off center. So I've invited Eckhart Tolle to be with us this morning. We have a slide. I don't know, hopefully you can see it. It says, "You are not in the universe. You are the universe, an intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself." What an amazing miracle. So that's really what my talk is about today. The title being, "The Divine Comes to Me Disguised as My Life."
That's a nice one.
So whose eyes are looking out at you right now? Whose eyes are you seeing? And whose eyes are looking at what you're looking at? Just a little prop, all these things help. Maybe you'll remember that during the week. Because it's true to say that we get enthralled, don't we, by this human experience. And we start to look at it only as a human experience. And we see it as the cut and thrust of one human with another. And soon we forget about this whole other dimension of ourselves. We're just masks, fighting and arguing and trying to get the better of each other. And so we're in week 8 of our 9-week fall program based on Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ. And today's material is the essence of the book. This is the core of the whole book for me. And there are 2 sections, 2 chapters that we're reading for the week, but in all honesty, I'm only going to talk about the first section. There was so much in there, I didn't even get to the second. I'll do a talk down the road on that second piece. And what the book is doing, and what Richard Rohr is doing in this section, is pulling back from all of this material. We get so into little pieces of it. And now he's looking at the broader picture, the bigger picture of the whole shooting gallery, so to speak. An overview of what reality really is, capital R. What's your reality? How does it relate to the reality? And so he's exposing for us the spiritual journey that we need to go through in order to come into that deeper reality. And for our examples, he's using the life of Jesus, of Mary Magdalene, and of St. Paul. And so Jesus is, in the Gospels and in his book, he's given there as an example for us to look at. Kind of like, reading the mythologies, the Greek mythologies of the various characters. And the idea is that you look at that and you think, okay, well, what does that story say to me? How do I relate to that character? And then we're given also, of course, all these magnificent characters in the Gospels, Mary Magdalene being one, and St. Paul being a very important other one. And they're showing us how to navigate this mystery of intertwining realities, if you will, of how to deal with the world. And of course, Jesus, as we say in unity, is a way shower. He's showing us how to do it. And a symbol then for us, so that we can insert our name wherever his name crops up. And Mary Magdalene and Paul are also symbols for us of how to make the journey, what the relationship is to Jesus, if any, and what's the relationship with this thing that we call the Christ. Now, in terms of Jesus, So what was his deal? What was his story? What was that all about anyway? And for him, if you boil it all down, it would come to one thing. God and I are one. And the God that he experienced was this father-mother figure that was so connected and so tender and just held him and communicated with him all of his life through all of the experiences. It was this intimate God that we talk about, love. And it states very clearly that just because you have this intimate connection with the divine, that suffering is not excluded, which is one of the things that we all kind of hope for. Kind of think, well, if I can get well in with the divine, then we can let go of the suffering. We've got it made. Easy street. No. But what he shows us is how to deal with this road of suffering that pops up every now and then, and how it's all part of the realities and how they intertwine and mix. And he shows us how then to navigate all of life's experiences, because one of the things that you notice in the story is that there are all these ups and downs. There are the people who accept him. There are the people who reject him. There are the people who hate him. There are the people who talk badly about him. There are the people who betray him. It's a regular soap opera. And through all of that, we see him showing us how to develop that inner potential in his humanity to develop the divinity, so that there's this beautiful melding of the two, including death. And in that process, he discovers how to become a Christ, which is another name for everything in its fullness, as Richard Rohr says. Very different from the traditional definition that has been given of a Christ. What you could say, well, what does that feel like? It feels like oneness. It feels like unity consciousness, that you are everything and you are connected to everything, and that you are loving everything, because it's all you. It's the mind that sees the connection to everything and everyone. It's a web, a we web. We're all caught up in our little I web, and that only extends just around us, our family, our neighbors, our workplace, our community here. When you look at that in comparison to the we web, which is connection with the universe, this other little web is so small, it might as well be a spider web. And what do spider webs do? They try to catch things. They try to kill things. It's not very expansive, is it? Or it's not very loving. And yet, we continually choose that web rather than the World Wide Web, the universal web of divinity in humanity. That's what's on offer. Why are we continually fascinated with this little web, enthralled, with these little connections, instead of opening ourselves to this much bigger mind? Now, Christianity would say that Jesus was the first human being to experience that universal web, that that's what it meant to be the Christ, and that all of the other spiritual masters, while they may have been great spiritual masters, Christianity would say he was the first to really completely embody that connection. And I know that there are many people who get upset about that and resist that, and maybe some of you right now are feeling a little uncomfortable as I say that. Well, what about Buddha? Don't go there. Just stay with me for now. What if there was something special about Jesus? What if he had a unique role in this universe, or on this planet at least? Can we just open for a moment to that possibility? Okay. not go into reaction, not to have our allergic reactions, because we have all of our allergies about the Old Testament, about the New Testament, about Paul, about Jesus, about the Bible. We have all these allergies. We need some antihistamines. So taking a deep breath is the antihistamine this morning. Because it can be a block to our growth. So it's good for us to acknowledge where the allergy is and how strong of an allergy is it. Do you feel like you need to go to the emergency room right now? Okay. How allergic are you to Jesus? How allergic are you to this Christ stuff? Good to just note that. And then to say, am I willing to experiment here? Am I willing to open up and have a little more room around this? And today's material offers two paths to relate with Jesus and Christ. And it's modeled in the lives of Mary Magdalene and Paul. And so the first path, or the first trajectory, is from Jesus to Christ. That's the Mary Magdalene path. And then we have the second path, which is Paul's journey, from Christ to Jesus. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before in the New Testament, but it's right there. And we are asked to move past the question of Jesus' role or specialness and see what historically is being presented. There's two things being presented. So if we look at the life of Mary Magdalene, we see that she came to experience Christ through her personal relationship with Jesus. You could infer from the Gospels that she was in love with him. In a human way, she was very taken with him. And, many say also that Jesus was in love with her. But that it included that love, but it transcended it. She loved the concrete Jesus, but through that love, grew to love the experience of the Christ that he became. And the message is very clear for us there if we look at it. We must love the particular to come to the general. If we want to have this universal love, the love of and for the universe, we must start right here in this moment, loving what is concrete and in form in this room, as it's showing up right now. We go from the micro to the macro, from intimate to infinite. And Mary Magdalene and Paul come to an experience of a divine human presence from opposite ends of the spectrum, from, in a sense, two different journeys. Mary Magdalene through humanity, Paul through the divine. If we go back to Easter Sunday, that first Easter Sunday, very quickly, there's an empty tomb. Mary Magdalene is the one who goes to anoint the body. She finds an empty tomb, she sees angels, and she sees a gardener. What she sees is the divine, disguised in human form. In a particular form. The gardener is the divine. It's everybody. It's everyone. And suddenly, she has that understanding, and the gardener speaks to her, calling her by name. How could this unknown being know her and call her name? Mary Magdalene is seeing relationally. She's not seeing with her eyes and hearing with her ears and understanding with her own mind. She's going through something much deeper. There's an inner wisdom, an inner seeing and vision here. And then there's the famous line when Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, "Do not cling to me, Nole me tangere. Don't touch me. Don't hold on to me. And what that means is the Christ is not graspable in singular form because it is omnipresent in all forms. It can be experienced one form at a time, but you can't grab hold of it and keep it and put it in a box or take it home and put it in the closet. It doesn't work like that. And that's what we're also all trying to do, isn't it? We're all trying to make God small enough that we feel we can be in control of it. But the Christ is not limited to one form. It's in all forms. In its wholeness, it expresses in and through all forms. And so then, the lesson is we can't reject any part of creation, human, animal, plant, mineral, but we must embrace it all in order to experience the divine in its fullness as the Christ, expressing in this universe. And we must go further than that. Once we recognize it, we must love it as ourself. Do you see how the great commandment works? If you want to love God, what must you do? You must love God and your neighbor as yourself. Because it is yourself. All of it is yourself. The body of the divine, the body of the Christ, is in the form of creation. And that was the central doctrine of the body of Christ that Paul preached in the early church. That was the thing that they understood. That all of this is infused with the divine spirit, and therefore it is the body of Christ. Again, from the micro level of one human being being made up of physical particles and spirit, to the whole universe is made up of physical particles and spirit. It's a holographic universe. We're merely reflections of the whole thing. And we know that we cannot love the God you don't see unless you love the God you do see. Right out of the New Testament. We're kidding ourselves if we think that we can go off into our little room and we're going to love the divine and somehow not love what we're interacting with each day. And so Jesus, again, there is outlining for us, the whole journey is really about from love to love. That's the spiritual journey. Returning, the prodigal son returning to home, where we are really, truly at home right now because we know this is spirit and human physicality in this beautiful mix. And Jesus is showing who we are becoming. And we must love what we are becoming, just like God does. This universe is evolving and unfolding to an end result. From Jesus to Christ, from insert your name here to Christ. From Jerry to Christ. So we're going to repeat that and you're going to say your name. Together. From Jerry to Christ. That's what's happening in your spiritual journey. And it's achieved by listening again, as we talked about a few weeks back, the inner voice of guidance of the same Christ presence that was in Jesus, that he experienced in his time, in his life, in his body. We are encountering that same presence within us. And it is guiding us, and it's evolving us, and it's evolving humanity as each one of us evolves. Mary Magdalene went from loving Jesus to experience the presence of the Christ in Jesus, and then in herself. She was the first apostle. She was a witness to the resurrected Christ. She was a woman who went to the 12 men to tell them about the transformation that had taken place. And yet women can't become priests. Okay. Good. Some allergies are coming up on us. And the deeper message from the tomb story is we must hear our name. We must identify with our true self. We must hear that name spoken from the divine, from the voice inside of us, and we must be acknowledged as love, as another Christ. And we must feel that we are regarded by the divine and by love before we can know that we are a Christ. And it's in hearing her name spoken, she received a transmission of love that let her know Jesus and she were both part of the same Christ matrix. There was an inner touching of her heart that forever changed her, and that changed the apostles, that those early Christians were on fire because they knew something different about themselves. And we're talking 2,000 years ago, when you didn't have the internet, and you didn't have Super Soul Sunday with Oprah, and all of this nice, wonderful, warm spirituality that you could plug into. No, it was the God of the Old Testament that was being given to people. And yet, they awoke out of that mindset to something incredible. And unless we have that inner experience, we are going to continually looking externally at the world for love, for identity, for our sense of self, for the divine, for the Christ experience. It has to be experienced in here first. Otherwise, we're always going to try and limit God to one form, in one place, in a building, in a religion. God has never been limited to one religion. By definition, if God is God, then God has to be everywhere and universally present and acceptable. That's why we say that prayer at the beginning always. Experienced as our lives and as the universe. And those who recognize the presence in themselves, they're the ones that are most able to speak with authority about it. When you have come into contact with someone who's had the encounter with the divine and who knows who they are, you know that. Because they're speaking from experience, they're speaking from authority. And they proclaim it then to the world. They're on a mission. They're transmitting enthusiastically that knowingness, and they want you to be in that place with them, to have this experience too. But first, we have to go on that inner journey of experiencing the divine presence and love, to be touched by that. And that when we think about God, we then automatically go to feeling love. Because that's what the real experience is about. And we become living witnesses of a transformed life, just as Mary Magdalene did. She didn't cling to the old relationship with Jesus. She let it go and she embraced a new experience of a Christ, a risen Jesus, that transcended and included her relationship with the human Jesus. And so it's meant to move on and through Jesus to Christ. That's what's supposed to happen in this process. Transcending and including. And what came to me was, it's kind of like if you're an artistic intern and you're at the feet of this great master, you're there to learn everything, to develop your own expression. You're not there to copy what he or she has done. You're there to develop your own potential and your own vision of what it means to be an artist. But once that happens, you don't then cut your relationship off with the master. This person has been a mentor to you. You stay connected with that master. The question is, have we cut off our relationship with Jesus, thinking that that's fine, just leave him in the dust, leave him in the past, move on to the Christ experience? Jesus is still this portal that has the ability to bring us into connection with the Christ. Why would we discard that? The second path is given to us or shown to us in the life of Paul. The thing about Paul is he never knew Jesus. He never met Jesus. But after Jesus was crucified and after the early Christians started to form communities, he was a Pharisee. In the early 30s, that's the first century, he went out and persecuted the Christian community. He killed people. He stood by as they stoned Stephen. So he wasn't neutral. And he started out with the followers of Jesus, attacking them, killing them, until he was struck by the universal Christ one day on his horse as he was going to persecute people in Damascus. He was knocked off his horse. He became blind. He saw this incredible blinding light, which points to something again for us. There's a common experience. There's a common core to waking up. And it is an experience of the divine as light, as information, as love, as a presence. And that presence we call the Christ. And he was left with a universal vision that came, in a sense, from the life of Christ, but as of the life of Jesus, but as the risen Christ. That's what he encountered, was the risen Christ. Still sort of looking like a human called Jesus. But he starts with the Christ experience, and then he works back to having a relationship with Jesus. And so there's a profound conversion from hate to self-love, to group love, to this magnificent universal vision and love for the universe. And he saw systematic evil, which is a lack of love. He saw corporate blindness and the illusion that the world is caught up in, unconscious behavior. And he saw all of that as the problem, not so much the individuals, because he knew that they were just unconscious, caught up in it. He wasn't obsessed with sexuality, even though he is presented often as that. And many of the passages that supposedly are about that were not written by Paul, we discover. Other people started inserting all that. And so he sees the human condition as an entrapment, as an enslavement, when we don't know our true identity as Christ. And of course, he saw the solution as corporate goodness, group consciousness and love and action. The body of Christ. In other words, a body of believers who come together like we do, like-minded people who know themselves to be the Christ and who help each other to express that in action. That's what he was trying to do when he wrote all these letters to all the different communities around the Mediterranean. He called it the church. And it acts as the hands and the feet and the body of this Christ presence. And I love what Richard Rohr does. He says, we have to withdraw our enthrallment with all of these passing kingdoms that we're involved in, except for one, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the divine that we can experience within ourselves. Seeing the divine in all, disguised in all. And that's the out that we need, because it lets us have respectful treatment of ourselves and one another. Paul doesn't speak so much of personal sin and the need for forgiveness of personal sin, but of a blanket forgiveness of this unconsciousness, of this enslavement that we're all in. But of course the ego doesn't like that. The ego wants retribution. The ego wants punishment on an individual basis. It'll punish yourself, it'll punish your neighbor, and it'll punish whole groups and nations if necessary. And so Paul is inviting us to move past that game of the ego. And Richard Rohr says that for Paul, it's a big Game of Thrones. How many of you watched the series Game of Thrones? Not too many. Okay. Game of Thrones was this big, epic, 9-season long, drama about all these different kingdoms fighting against each other. And of course, all of the infighting about who should be king and who should be queen in each of those kingdoms. And who was going to be the top dog. It was this world of dog eat dog. Apologies to dogs. And the alternative is to find the inner voice, the inner beingness, the kingdom within. The inner spirit, not the external law or the government, which is good advice to us now. All external must fail. We have to turn within, to the government within. The new law is written in our hearts, the inner authority, the inner compass. And our conscience then is an expression of that inner voice, bearing witness to the truth of our being. So a church or a spiritual center is meant to be an audiovisual aid to this for people. And we bring people in. And we help them to hold this vision as we are building this vision this morning for ourselves once again. As we join with like-minded, Christ-seeing, identifying people to change and to heal what's going on out there. The second coming is that, when we all wake up to that. And it's bigger than us, but it's evolving, it's happening around us. When we were doing that meditation earlier, I had this sudden sense of joining hands with all of the good people in the world, all of the well-intentioned people in the world, the kind, the loving. And there is a force for good that is growing in the world. I had someone say to me last Tuesday evening in a group I was in, "Boy, I don't know where you get this vision from, because it's not what I'm seeing." And I wanted to say, yeah, I know, but you have to have that vision. It's an evolutionary